I stared at my reflection in the mirror, my fingers trembling slightly as I applied the final touch of lipstick. It had been a long time since I'd felt this nervous. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the fluttering in my stomach. Tonight was a new beginning, the first step in reclaiming my life. After months of convincing myself to move on from the painful breakup, I was finally ready to dip my toes back into the dating pool. Setting up the profile on the dating app had been both exhilarating and terrifying. My friends had pushed me into it, their voices full of encouragement. "You need to get out there again, Sarah," they said. "You deserve to be happy." So, here I was, about to meet Mark, the charming man who had quickly caught my interest. His messages had been witty and engaging, enough to make me laugh out loud on more than one occasion. He seemed perfect, almost too perfect. But I tried to silence the tiny voice of doubt nagging at the back of my mind. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the start of something wonderful. As I slipped into my favorite dress, I couldn't help but glance around my apartment, seeking comfort in its familiar surroundings. My sanctuary, my safe place. The thought of stepping out of it tonight made me uneasy, but I brushed the feeling aside. This was just first date jitters. I could do this. The drive to the restaurant was a blur of streetlights and radio songs, my mind too occupied with thoughts of Mark. When I finally pulled into the parking lot, I paused for a moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "You've got this," I whispered to myself before stepping out of the car. The restaurant was one of those cozy, dimly lit places that radiated warmth and intimacy. As I walked through the door, the soft hum of conversations and clinking of glasses welcomed me. I scanned the room, searching for a face that matched the photos I'd seen. And there he was. Mark stood up from a corner table, his smile broadening as our eyes met. He was even more handsome in person, his eyes a striking blue that seemed to sparkle under the ambient light. "Sarah?" he asked, his voice smooth and inviting. "Yes, hi Mark," I replied, my voice slightly shaky. He pulled out a chair for me, a gentlemanly gesture that made me feel a bit more at ease. We exchanged pleasantries, and soon enough, the conversation began to flow naturally. He told me about his job as a graphic designer, his love for hiking and his fascination with true crime documentaries. I found myself laughing at his anecdotes, feeling the tension slowly melt away. He seemed genuinely interested in my life, asking thoughtful questions and listening intently to my responses. But as the night wore on, little things began to prick at my senses. He seemed to know more about me than I had shared. When I mentioned my favorite book, he nodded knowingly, despite never discussing it before. When I described my recent trip to the mountains, he commented on details I hadn't mentioned. It was unsettling, but I brushed it off as coincidence or maybe the result of our extensive messaging. The evening was drawing to a close, and I felt a mix of relief and disappointment. Relief because the first date nerves were behind me, and disappointment because I didn't want the night to end. Mark seemed to sense this and suggested a walk to prolong our time together. I hesitated, my instincts flaring up, but his smile was so sincere, so reassuring. As we left the restaurant, the night air was cool against my skin. The streetlights cast long shadows, adding a touch of eeriness to the otherwise charming neighborhood. We strolled along the sidewalk, our conversation continuing effortlessly. Yet, there was an underlying tension that I couldn't shake. When we reached my building, I turned to say goodnight, but Mark insisted on walking me to my door. I politely declined, but he was insistent, his demeanor shifting slightly. "It's late, Sarah. I just want to make sure you're safe," he said, his tone a mix of concern and something else I couldn't quite place. Against my better judgment, I let him walk me to my apartment. As I fumbled for my keys, the unease I'd been trying to ignore all night came crashing down on me. I finally found the key and turned to face Mark, ready to say goodbye. But before I could, he stepped closer, his expression hardening. "Can I come in for a moment?" he asked, his voice low. The way he looked at me sent a shiver down my spine. I don't think that's a good idea," I stammered, my heart racing. Mark's smile faded, replaced by a look of irritation. "Just for a minute," he insisted, his hand reaching out to grab my arm. Panic surged through me as I tried to pull away. "Please, Mark, it's late." "I think it's best if you go," I said, my voice trembling. But he didn't let go. Instead, his grip tightened and his eyes darkened. "I just want to talk," he said, his tone now menacing. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out of this situation. Summoning all my courage, I wrenched my arm free and quickly unlocked the door, slipping inside. But before I could shut it, Mark forced his way in, his face twisted in anger. The door slammed shut behind him, trapping me in my own apartment with a man who was no longer the charming date from earlier. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The room seemed to close in around me as Mark advanced, his eyes never leaving mine. I was alone, isolated, with no one to help me. "Sarah, we're not done yet," he said, his voice a chilling whisper. The fear that had been simmering all night boiled over, and I realized just how dangerous this situation had become. Mark's presence in my apartment was suffocating, a stark contrast to the charm he had exuded at dinner. He moved around with a confidence that suggested he had no intention of leaving anytime soon. I took a step back, my mind racing for a way to regain control. "Please, Mark, it's late." "I need to get some sleep," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He turned to me, his smile returning but now with an edge that made my skin crawl. "Just a few more minutes, Sarah. I really enjoyed our evening and wanted to talk more." His words were smooth, but his eyes betrayed a glint of something darker. I nodded, trying to appear calm, and gestured towards the living room. "Fine, we can talk for a bit. Have a seat." Mark walked over to the couch and sat down, looking too comfortable for my liking. I stayed near the door, my eyes never leaving him. The room felt smaller, the shadows from the dim lighting dancing ominously around us. "So, what did you want to talk about?" I asked, hoping to steer the conversation in a way that might give me an opportunity to get him out. Mark leaned back, his eyes scanning the room. "You have a lovely place, Sarah. Cozy. It tells me a lot about you." His comment sent a chill down my spine. "Thank you," I replied curtly. "But it's really late, and I have an early morning." Ignoring my hint, Mark continued. "I feel like we have a real connection, don't you? I mean, I know we've just met, but it feels like we've known each other for a long time." I forced a smile, the unease growing with each passing second. "Yes, but maybe we should continue this conversation another time. It's getting very late." He stood up abruptly, and I tensed. "You keep saying that, but I feel like you're trying to get rid of me," he said, his tone shifting from pleasant to accusatory. "I'm not trying to get rid of you, Mark. I'm just tired," I said, my voice shaking despite my efforts to stay calm. Mark stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "You know, Sarah, I don't like being lied to. It's disrespectful." My heart pounded in my chest. "I'm not lying. I just need to get some rest," I insisted, taking a step back. His expression darkened further, and he reached out to grab my arm again. "You don't seem to understand, Sarah. We're not done." Desperation surged through me. I needed to get him out before things escalated further. "Okay, let's sit down and talk," I said, trying to placate him. He released his grip and nodded. "Good. Let's sit." I guided him back to the couch and sat down opposite him, keeping the coffee table between us as a barrier. Mark's demeanor shifted again, back to the smooth talker from earlier in the evening. It was unnerving how quickly he could switch. "Tell me more about your work," he said, leaning forward. I forced myself to engage, hoping to keep him calm while I figured out my next move. "I work in marketing. It's challenging but rewarding." Mark nodded, seeming genuinely interested. "That sounds fascinating. I bet you're very good at it." "Thanks," I replied, my mind elsewhere, scanning the room for anything I could use to defend myself if needed. As the conversation continued, the dissonance between his charming words and the menacing vibe he gave off made my skin crawl. I needed to get out of this situation. My phone was in my purse on the kitchen counter, too far to reach without drawing attention. Trying to keep the conversation light, I asked, "So, Mark, where did you grow up?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "A small town. Nothing special." The vague response only heightened my suspicion. I decided to try another approach. "Do you have any siblings?" His expression hardened for a moment before he forced another smile. "No, it was just me. And my parents." I nodded, sensing a sore spot. "That must have been tough." "It had its moments," he replied curtly. I glanced at the clock, hoping he would take the hint. "It's really getting late, Mark." This time, his reaction was swift and frightening. He stood up, his eyes blazing with anger. "Why do you keep pushing me away? We had such a good time." My heart raced. "I'm not pushing you away. I'm just tired." He took a step towards me, his voice low and threatening. "You're lying. You don't want me here." "That's not true," I lied, backing up again. "I just need some rest." He moved closer, and I could feel the tension crackling in the air. "You think you can just brush me off after leading me on?" Panic surged through me. I needed to do something, anything. "No, Mark, please. Let's just talk." But he wasn't listening. His eyes were wild, his movements erratic. "You think I'm stupid? That I don't see what you're doing?" I tried to maintain eye contact, hoping to calm him. "No, I don't think that. I just dash." He lunged at me, and I barely had time to react. I twisted away, running towards the kitchen. Mark was right behind me, his footsteps heavy and fast. I grabbed a knife from the counter, turning to face him. "Stay back," I shouted, my hands shaking. Mark stopped, his eyes locked on the knife. "Put that down, Sarah. Get out of my apartment." I screamed, my voice echoing through the room. For a moment, he hesitated, then took a step back, a sneer curling his lips. "This isn't over, Sarah." With that, he turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. I stood there, panting, the knife still in my hand. The apartment was eerily silent, but I knew this was far from over. I barely slept that night, my mind replaying the horrifying events over and over. Every creak and groan of my apartment seemed amplified, each noise sending a fresh wave of fear through me. I kept the knife close, my only source of comfort. When the first light of dawn finally seeped through the curtains, I felt a semblance of relief, though my exhaustion was palpable. I dragged myself out of bed, deciding to skip work and call in sick. There was no way I could focus on anything other than what had happened and what might happen next. I needed to get through to the police. I needed to find a way to feel safe again. After a long shower, I sat down with a cup of coffee and dialed 911. The operator listened patiently as I recounted the previous night's events, my voice trembling. "We'll send an officer to take your statement," she said. "Try to stay calm. You're safe now." But was I really safe? I couldn't shake the feeling that Mark would come back. The way he'd looked at me, the anger in his eyes, it was something I couldn't forget. A knock on the door startled me, and my heart leapt into my throat. I approached cautiously, peering through the peephole. A uniformed officer stood on the other side, looking serious but kind. I let out a shaky breath and opened the door. "Miss Sarah Miller?" he asked. "Yes, that's me," I replied, my voice still unsteady. "I'm Officer Daniels. I understand you had an incident last night. May I come in?" I stepped aside, letting him enter. He took a seat on the couch, and I sat across from him, reliving the terror as I told him everything. He listened intently, taking notes and asking questions. "We'll do everything we can to find him," Officer Daniels assured me. "Do you have any other information about him? Anything that could help us track him down?" I shook my head. "Not much. Just what he told me on our date. His name is Mark, and he said he's a graphic designer, but I'm starting to doubt everything he said." The officer nodded. "We'll look into it. In the meantime, I suggest you stay with someone you trust or somewhere safe until we locate him." After he left, I called my best friend, Jess. She insisted I come stay with her for a few days. Grateful for the offer, I packed a bag and drove to her apartment across town. The sense of relief at not being alone was immense. Jess hugged me tightly when I arrived. "Sarah, I'm so sorry you went through that. You're safe here, I promise." Her apartment felt like a sanctuary, and for the first time since the date, I allowed myself to relax a little. We spent the day watching movies and talking about anything but what had happened. Jess was a comforting presence, her cheerful demeanor a balm to my frayed nerves. As night fell, though, my anxiety began to creep back in. The shadows seemed to lengthen, the quiet of the apartment pressing down on me. Jess noticed and did her best to keep me distracted, but the fear was insidious. "I'll stay up with you," she said, her tone firm. "You need to sleep, but I'll keep watch." Despite her assurance, sleep was elusive. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mark's face, his anger, his menacing smile. I finally dozed off in the early hours of the morning, exhaustion taking over. The next day, I decided to go back to my apartment to gather more of my things. Jess offered to come with me, but I insisted on going alone. I needed to face my fear head-on, to reclaim my space. As I pulled into my parking spot, unease settled in my stomach. The building loomed over me, suddenly foreboding. I steeled myself and walked up to my door, my keys jangling in my shaky hand. The apartment was just as I'd left it, but it felt different, violated. I quickly grabbed more clothes and personal items, constantly glancing over my shoulder. My phone buzzed with a text from Jess, checking in on me. I assured her I was fine, though I didn't believe it myself. As I packed, I noticed something out of place, a photo frame on my dresser, slightly askew. My heart skipped a beat. I had always been meticulous about my things. Had it always been like that, or had Mark returned? I cautiously approached the frame and straightened it, my pulse racing. Then, I saw a small piece of paper tucked behind the frame. With trembling hands, I unfolded it. "Sarah, we're not finished. See you soon. Mark." Panic surged through me. He had been here, and he knew I would find the note. I frantically finished packing, throwing things into my bag. I needed to leave, now. As I rushed towards the door, I heard a noise from the hallway, a faint scraping, like something being dragged. I froze, listening. The noise grew louder, closer. I peered through the peephole, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear. Mark stood there, his eyes scanning the hallway, a sinister smile spreading across his face. He was looking for me. I stepped back, my mind racing. I couldn't go out there. He'd find me. But staying here was just as dangerous. The fear was paralyzing, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. The sound of the door creaking open was the only warning I had. Mark had a key. The door creaked open, and the sight of Mark standing there sent a jolt of terror through me. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed into the bedroom, searching desperately for anything I could use to defend myself. The knife I had kept near me last night was still on the kitchen counter, too far to reach now. Mark stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a slow, deliberate motion. His eyes locked onto mine, and the sinister smile that curled his lips made my blood run cold. "Sarah, you really should be more careful with your spare keys," he said, holding up the key I'd hidden in the potted plant outside my door. Panic surged through me. How had he known? My mind raced, trying to recall every interaction, every message we'd exchanged. He must have been watching me, studying me. "Mark, please," I pleaded, my voice trembling. "You don't have to do this." He took a step closer, his eyes dark and unyielding. "Oh, but I do, Sarah. You see, we have unfinished business." Without another word, I bolted towards the bathroom, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone, trying to dial 911, but the screen remained dark. He must have cut the power. The realization sent a fresh wave of dread through me. Banging on the bathroom door jolted me back to the present. "Sarah, come out. We need to talk," Mark's voice called, deceptively calm. I looked around the small room, my eyes landing on the tiny window above the shower. It was my only chance. I climbed onto the edge of the bathtub, struggling to push the window open. The gap was narrow, but I was desperate. The door shook as Mark pounded on it harder, the wood starting to splinter. I pushed myself through the window, scraping my arms and legs in the process. The cool air hit my face as I tumbled out, landing awkwardly on the ground below. I didn't stop to look back. I ran, my heart racing, every muscle screaming in protest. My only thought was to get away, to find help. The streets were eerily quiet, and I didn't dare slow down. I heard footsteps behind me, and the terror that he was chasing me propelled me forward. I darted into a nearby alley, hoping to lose him in the maze of back streets. My breath came in ragged gasps as I searched for a place to hide. Spotting a dumpster, I squeezed myself behind it, trying to control my breathing. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped. I pressed myself against the wall, my heart pounding in my ears. Mark's voice echoed through the alley, cold and taunting. "Sarah, come out, wherever you are." I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to disappear. The silence stretched on, and I dared to peek around the corner. Mark was gone. The relief was short-lived, replaced by the urgency to find safety. I slipped out of my hiding spot and continued through the alley, my eyes scanning for any sign of movement. I needed to find a place to call for help. A flickering streetlight ahead caught my attention, and I headed towards it, hoping it would lead me to a more populated area. As I rounded the corner, I saw a small park. It was deserted, the playground equipment casting long, eerie shadows in the moonlight. I knew I couldn't stay in the open, but I needed to catch my breath and think. I ducked behind a tree, my mind racing. I needed to get to a public place, somewhere with people and lights. My phone was useless without power, but maybe I could find a payphone or a store that was still open. The sound of footsteps made me freeze. I peered around the tree, my heart sinking as I saw Mark entering the park. He moved with purpose, scanning the area, knowing I couldn't have gone far. I held my breath, inching further around the tree to stay out of sight. Mark's voice cut through the silence, sharp and angry. "Sarah, you can't hide forever. Come out, and we can end this." I needed a plan, and fast. I looked around, spotting the playground slide. It was a risky move, but if I could climb up and hide at the top, maybe I could evade him long enough to find another way out. Carefully, I crept towards the playground, every step calculated to avoid making noise. I climbed up the slide, trying to keep my movements slow and silent. I reached the top and huddled down, peering through the small openings. Mark was getting closer, his frustration evident in his movements. I prayed he wouldn't think to look up here. The minutes felt like hours as he searched the park, coming dangerously close to my hiding spot. Just when I thought he might leave, his phone rang. He answered it, his voice low and tense. "Yes, I'm still looking. She can't have gone far." As he talked, I saw my chance. I carefully slid down the other side of the playground, keeping as low as possible. I ran towards the edge of the park, my eyes on the streetlights in the distance. Safety felt so close, yet so far. I bolted from the park, my legs burning with exertion, my heart pounding in my ears. The streetlights ahead seemed like beacons of hope, promising safety and escape. But as I glanced back, Mark was still there, his silhouette relentless in its pursuit. Fear gnawed at my insides, but I couldn't afford to stop. My mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. I needed to reach a public place, somewhere with people. My phone was still dead, useless weight in my pocket. I scanned the street ahead, desperately seeking a lifeline. A convenience store, its neon sign flickering, appeared like a mirage in the distance. It was my best shot. I sprinted towards the store, praying it was open. My breath came in ragged gasps as I reached the door and yanked it open. The bell chimed overhead, announcing my arrival. I stumbled inside, the fluorescent lights harsh against my eyes. The cashier looked up, startled by my disheveled appearance. "Are you okay?" he asked, his concern evident. "Please, call the police," I gasped. "Someone's trying to kill me." The cashier's eyes widened, and he reached for the phone behind the counter. As he dialed, I glanced back at the door, expecting Mark to burst in at any moment. The seconds felt like hours as the cashier spoke to the dispatcher, his voice steady despite the urgency of the situation. "Help is on the way," he said, hanging up. "You can stay here until they arrive." I nodded, trying to steady my breathing. The store felt like a fragile sanctuary, its walls thin and vulnerable. I moved towards the back, wanting to put as much distance between myself and the entrance as possible. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching my nerves to the breaking point. I paced the narrow aisles, my eyes darting to the door with every sound. The cashier kept glancing at me, his concern palpable. Then, the bell above the door chimed again. My heart lurched as I turned to see Mark standing there, his eyes locking onto mine. His calm demeanor was gone, replaced by a look of cold determination. "Sarah," he called, his voice echoing through the store. "You can't hide forever." The cashier stepped forward, trying to intervene. "Hey, man, you need to leave. The police are on their way." Mark ignored him, his focus entirely on me. He took a step forward, and I backed away, my mind racing for a way out. The store's layout offered little in terms of escape routes, but I had to do something. Desperation gave me an idea. I grabbed a can from the shelf and hurled it at Mark. He dodged it easily, but it bought me a few precious seconds. I ran towards the back of the store, searching for an exit. A door marked "Employees Only" caught my eye, and I bolted through it. The back room was cluttered with boxes and shelves, a narrow corridor leading to a rear exit. I pushed through, the door giving way to a dark alley. The chill night air hit me as I stumbled outside, my legs aching from the relentless running. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I ran down the alley, my shoes slapping against the pavement. The sound of footsteps behind me spurred me on, a relentless reminder that Mark was still on my heels. The alley opened up to another street, quieter than the last. I scanned my surroundings, looking for a place to hide. A small, rundown motel caught my eye. Its sign flickered, casting an eerie glow. It was a long shot, but it was all I had. I darted across the street, nearly slipping as I reached the motel's entrance. The lobby was empty, a single night clerk dozing behind the counter. I rushed in, slamming my hands on the counter to wake him. "Please, I need a room," I begged, my voice frantic. The clerk, startled, blinked at me. Sure. Just dash. I don't have time." I cut him off. "Just give me a key." He fumbled with the keys, finally handing one to me. I grabbed it and ran down the dimly lit corridor, my steps echoing off the walls. The room was at the end of the hall, and I practically threw myself inside, locking the door behind me. I collapsed against the door, my breath coming in ragged sobs. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe I was safe. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Mark was still out there, and he wouldn't stop until he found me. I scanned the room, my eyes landing on the flimsy nightstand. I dragged it over to the door, barricading it as best I could. The room was small, with a single window covered by heavy drapes. I peeked outside, but the darkness revealed nothing. I slumped down on the bed, my body trembling from exhaustion and fear. I had to think of something, some way to end this nightmare. My mind raced through every possibility, but each one seemed more futile than the last. Just then, a noise from the hallway made my blood run cold. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, growing closer. I pressed myself against the door, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps stopped outside my room. There was a moment of silence, then a soft knock. "Sarah, I know you're in there," Mark's voice called, calm and terrifying. "Open the door, and we can talk." I pressed myself against the door, the flimsy nightstand my only barricade. Mark's calm voice sent shivers down my spine. "Sarah, open the door. We need to talk." The cold, calculated tone in his voice made my blood run cold. I knew there was no reasoning with him. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan, but panic clouded my thoughts. The door rattled as Mark tried the handle. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he said, his voice eerily composed. "We can end this right now." I had to act. I grabbed the lamp from the bedside table, holding it like a weapon. My eyes darted around the room, searching for anything else I could use. The motel room was sparsely furnished, offering little in terms of defense. Mark's patience was wearing thin. The door shook violently as he pounded on it. "Sarah, open this door right now," he shouted, his composure finally cracking. I backed away, my heart racing. The window was my only other option. I pulled the heavy drapes aside and fumbled with the lock, throwing it open. The night air rushed in, and I climbed out, landing on the narrow ledge outside. I carefully edged along the ledge, my back pressed against the wall. Below, the dark alley stretched out, a potential escape route. I looked down, calculating the drop. It wasn't far, but the landing would be hard. Behind me, the door finally gave way with a loud crash. Mark's footsteps echoed in the room, and I knew I had to jump. Taking a deep breath, I pushed off the ledge, landing awkwardly on the ground below. Pain shot through my ankle, but I forced myself to stand. I limped away from the motel, the fear driving me forward. The streets were eerily silent, the only sound my labored breathing. I needed to find help, but the emptiness of the city at this hour offered no comfort. The sound of footsteps behind me spurred me on. I glanced back and saw Mark emerging from the motel, his silhouette dark against the dim light. He was relentless, a predator in pursuit. I turned a corner, hoping to find a hiding place. My ankle throbbed, but I pushed through the pain. I spotted a small park up ahead and headed towards it, the shadows offering some semblance of cover. I ducked behind a large tree, trying to steady my breathing. The park was empty, the playground equipment casting eerie shadows in the moonlight. I peered around the tree, watching as Mark entered the park, his eyes scanning the area. "Sarah," he called, his voice carrying through the night. "You can't hide forever. Come out, and we can end this." I crouched lower, my mind racing. I needed to lure him away, to buy myself more time. A plan began to form, desperate but my only option. I grabbed a rock from the ground and threw it towards the opposite end of the park, hoping to distract him. The rock clattered against a metal slide, and Mark's head snapped in that direction. He moved towards the noise, giving me a chance to slip away. I crept along the shadows, keeping low and silent. As I neared the edge of the park, I spotted a maintenance shed. It was small, but it might offer some protection. I hurried towards it, praying it was unlocked. My luck held, and the door creaked open. I slipped inside, closing it softly behind me. The shed was cramped and dark, filled with gardening tools and equipment. I grabbed a rusty shovel, holding it tightly. My breath came in shallow gasps, the fear pressing down on me. Outside, I heard Mark's footsteps approaching. He was methodical, checking every possible hiding place. The shed was my last hope, my final stand. I pressed myself against the wall, the shovel ready. The door to the shed rattled, and I held my breath. Mark's voice was just outside, low and menacing. "Sarah, I know you're in there. Come out, and we can end this." The door creaked open, and Mark stepped inside. The dim light from the park cast his face in shadow, making him look even more sinister. I tightened my grip on the shovel, my heart pounding in my ears. He took a step closer, his eyes scanning the shed. "This game is over, Sarah," he said, his voice cold. "There's no escape." I waited until he was closer, every muscle tensed. When he was within reach, I swung the shovel with all my strength, aiming for his head. The impact was solid, and Mark staggered back, a look of shock on his face. I didn't wait for him to recover. I pushed past him, running out of the shed. Mark was disoriented, but I knew it wouldn't last long. I ran towards the exit of the park, the fear driving me forward. I burst out of the park, my breath coming in desperate gasps. Every muscle in my body ached, but the adrenaline kept me moving. The streets were empty, the eerie silence only broken by the distant hum of the city. Mark was still behind me, relentless in his pursuit. I couldn't stop now. I had to find a way to end this once and for all. I spotted a dimly lit street ahead, the faint glow of a 24-hour diner at the corner. It was my best chance. I sprinted towards it, the pain in my ankle almost unbearable, but I pushed through. The diner's neon sign flickered, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. I burst through the door, startling the few patrons inside. The waitress behind the counter looked up, alarmed by my disheveled appearance. "Help me," I gasped, my voice hoarse. "Someone's trying to kill me." The diner's patrons turned to look, their faces a mix of confusion and concern. The waitress quickly grabbed the phone. "I'm calling the police," she said, her voice steady despite the situation. I glanced back at the door, expecting Mark to follow. The fear gnawed at me, every second feeling like an eternity. The patrons whispered among themselves, but I couldn't focus on their words. My entire being was consumed by the need to survive. The bell above the door chimed, and I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. But it wasn't Mark, it was a middle-aged couple, looking confused by the tension in the room. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Mark was still out there, and it was only a matter of time before he found me. The police arrived quickly, 2 officers entering the diner with their hands on their holsters. The sight of them brought a wave of relief, but I knew it wasn't over yet. "He's out there," I said, my voice trembling. "His name is Mark. He's been chasing me." The officers nodded, one of them speaking into his radio. "We'll search the area, ma'am. You're safe now." But I didn't feel safe. Not yet. I stayed in the diner, watching as the officers moved outside, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching my nerves to the breaking point. Then, the sound of a scuffle outside drew my attention. I pressed my face against the glass, straining to see. The officers had found him. Mark was struggling, his face twisted with rage as they wrestled him to the ground. I stepped outside, watching as they cuffed him and hauled him to his feet. His eyes met mine, and a chill ran down my spine. "This isn't over, Sarah," he spat, his voice venomous. "I'll find you." The officers pushed him into the back of the squad car, and I watched as they drove away. The tension in my body slowly began to ebb, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. It was finally over. I was safe. The officers returned, taking my statement and reassuring me that Mark would be charged and held. "You're safe now," one of them said, his voice kind. "He won't hurt you again." I nodded, but the trauma of the past hours clung to me. I knew it would take time to feel truly safe again. The officers offered to drive me back to Jess's apartment, and I gratefully accepted. The ride was quiet, the events of the night playing over and over in my mind. Jess was waiting at the door, her face pale with worry. She enveloped me in a hug, her relief palpable. "Thank God you're okay," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I clung to her, my own tears finally spilling over. "It's over," I said, more to convince myself than her. "It's finally over." The following days were a blur of police reports, statements, and attempts to piece my life back together. Jess was a constant presence, her support unwavering. The knowledge that Mark was behind bars brought some comfort, but the scars of the ordeal remained. One evening, as we sat on the couch, Jess turned to me, her expression serious. "You need to talk to someone about this, Sarah. A therapist. What you went through, it's not something you can handle alone." I nodded, knowing she was right. The fear still lingered, lurking in the corners of my mind. I needed help to move past it, to reclaim my life. With Jess's support, I began seeing a therapist, slowly working through the trauma. Each session was a step towards healing, a way to process the fear and reclaim my sense of security. It was a long journey, but I was determined to take it. Weeks turned into months, and the nightmares gradually faded. The fear that had gripped me began to loosen its hold. I found strength in my resilience, in the support of my friends, and in the knowledge that I had survived. One day, as I walked through the park that had once been the scene of my terror, I realized how far I'd come. The memories still lingered, but they no longer had the power to control me. I was stronger, braver, and more determined to live my life without fear. As I stood there, watching the sun set over the city, I knew that the nightmare was truly over. Mark was gone, and I was free. I had faced the darkness and emerged into the light. And for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace.